Thank you very much, Suchitra. I know that you said this is not an ode to Hannah Arendt, but I wanted to start with a quotation because when you start talking, I said she will probably mention Hannah Arendt in a couple of moments, and it's a quotation from I think it's the origin of totalitarianism, if I'm not sure. She wrote, "A stateless person is not just expelled from one country, native or adopted, but from all countries. None being obliged to receive and naturalize him, which means he's actually expelled from humanity. Deprivation of citizenship consequently could be counted among the crimes against humanity, and some of the worst recognized crimes in this category have in fact, and not incidentally, been preceded by mass acceptations." It's unfortunately, as you were in your talk, a very still relevant statement in our age. I noticed that you were trying to address our understanding of not only citizenship but nation state. And I've also had the same thoughts, and I will presume many in the audience have also, that not only in Western democracies, which we are now, Norway is a Western democracy, you came from the United States, which is a Western democracy, and you also have Eastern democracies like India. But is the nation state actually become a dogma? I don't have another term to use. Have it become a holy cow or something like this? That's something which shouldn't be addressed or shouldn't be tried to problematize. And why is it that so? Why can't we be honest about that? The nation state, with it, have its positive sides by it, but it's also have very negative and crucial an impact on people. Could you elaborate on that?
Okay, so I'm going to kind of split it into two, about Anna Arendt first, and then I don't have starting with a critique of Arendt is that I also feel that, as someone who is in graduate school, I was trained in very Anglo-Saxon European schools, whether it's England or back in the United States, where there's a very specific way in which we think about these texts. It's a conversation that I've had with a couple of my friends now, is that we do no longer critique texts that are written that are considered foundational to what is now seen Western European civilization, right? Again, that Western European civilization itself is something that's deeply problematic. And, the idea that somehow Greeks are part of Western civilization is, the point is that now we've again created a pedagogy that makes no sense for me. And I think critiquing someone like Arendt comes from a place where I feel that many of the things that she says now require to be challenged. And also she was writing... her writing on statelessness come from her own positions of being expelled, living in camps. I get that. But I think statelessness fundamentally comes from the idea that we have a state that is ruthless, a state that is based on hierarchies, and a state that is fundamentally built on racial differences. And unless and until we acknowledge that and challenge that, and I find it very, very hard to... I can no longer read Rousseau and all of these foundational texts and not feel that this no longer applies to my predicament or the predicament of many of the people globally who had no say in the so-called social contract of the state. And I think someone like Arendt must be critiqued. And that is taking into account whatever she has to say. So I think that critique is important. the nation state has never always been the holy grail. During the height of the decolonization movement, you have a lot of these colonial intellectuals, whether it's in India, whether it's Fanon, whether it's Senghor and Césaire. Again, they all are problematic in many ways, but then Gary Wilder wrote this book called The Freedom Time, which is a documentation of Césaire and Senghor having a conversation back and forth. One of the conversations they constantly have is, can we imagine freedom outside the bounds of nationalism? Tagore has a similar conversation in India. Similar conversations are happening pretty much in every community that is resisting colonization or fighting an empire. And that only happened 70 or 80 years ago. So people have always thought about this. Also, nationalism and the nation state is a result of a very specific European moment following Enlightenment. And that, again, has to be critiqued in ways in which it no longer helps think about how we think about freedom and rights. And I think that's where we begin. And it's, again, the question that I'm often asked is, if not the nation state, then what? Nation states have been, it's a form of organizing principle. It's how you organize your kitchen. There's no set way to organize your kitchen. If tomorrow you go in and you don't like your kitchen and you don't want your spices, who said the spices have to be next to your stove? If you don't want the spices, and you want it in a drawer next door, then you can change it. It's your kitchen. And again, then the decision would be who uses the kitchen. And the point is that these are things that can be organized in ways. And I think the point is that now we believe that these things are so set in stone, is the lack of imagination, is the lack of challenging anything. And I think that is where I think critiquing this happens. And I think it's important.
Because it's the same with citizenship that we're talking about. Because nation state, when I came back to Norway from holiday yesterday, there you have this line where the police is checking your passport, and it said borger, which means citizen in Norwegian. And I think many people here have gone through that line many times, but I haven't reflected about it, at the fact that there's a line for some people just because they are borger or citizen. Meanwhile, the others are in a other line, and the whole reason is because I am a citizen of this country, and does that make me better than other? And I think this might explain a lot of the hot button topics, like everything from refugees to another topic that we are having in Norway, but also a conversation which been happening in many European states is regarding European citizens who have been joining the terror group ISIS, and especially their children, which are, both of them are Norwegian citizens or British citizens. You have the Shamima Begum incident. And I know that this is a group which is very small, and we should be careful not generalize, but that topic and that group actually challenged a lot of European governments and administrations, but also the public in Europe and their understanding of citizenship, in that way that we have politicians, not only far right or populist, but even some moderate leftist politicians saying they don't have a sympathy for children just because they're children, even though those children are citizens of that country. And the only reason they don't have sympathy for them is because of their parents' doings. So my question is, and I have to ask that question because if you had more time, you would probably address it. And if we just stick to the Western democracies, is there a relationship between whiteness and citizenship? Is that can that explain some of these issues? That the definition of citizen in many countries, even though you can be black or brown and be a Norwegian or be a British or American, there is this accepted but not talked about that high, with few exceptions like Trump, who basically make America great again is make America white again.
Right. This idea of citizenship or belonging related to whiteness is always been the core of all kinds of citizenship. for instance, if you go back and look at the early between 1886 and about 1940, you have a lot of these migrants to the United States who are asking for citizenship and naturalization. And a lot of them are Parsis, Sikhs from India. And also there are Chinese migrants who come in and ask. And often the argument that they make is that, oh, I am Aryan, which means that I am white, so I have the right to citizenship. So that conversation about whiteness and because I'm white, I belong, is a conversation that migrant communities have made. Not migrant community. Again, I don't want to call them migrant communities. People demanding equal protection have made. In India, which is now run by a right-wing authoritarian prime minister who lauded over the genocide of Muslims and who then still gets elected to a democracy. And his party, the BJP and RSS, again, think of India's racialized citizenship in terms of Hinduism, which is a racial category. They believe that Muslims and Christians are not racially Hindu. Right? So this idea of racial otherness is somehow seems foundational to this idea. And what is the racial category of a Hindu? Who are the people that they think are racially Hindu? Are again Aryans. Who are Aryans? They're Indo-Europeans. Right? So this idea that whiteness somehow is part of it is fundamental and foundational to many of the citizenship questions that we have. Again, if you look at the New York Times coverage of the First and the Second World War and who we take as refugees, and there are lots of work that's done on how the Irish then become white, how the Jewish population becomes white. All of these populations were populations that were
I think even Arabs are considered white in the United States Census, if I'm not wrong.
I don't know. That's not the work that I do. So
yeah. So you've been from Irish to Arabs.
So there is an interesting conversation in which the Irish are, again goes into this reverse thing in which now there are conversations in which scholars say that, oh, the Irish were also slaves. And then now you're again going to this very weird racial thing is that, no, a group of people who were forcefully bought on a slave ship and who built a colonial settler colony that later becomes a nation is not the same as so again, this racial category of what is whiteness and what is not. And again, that has a different kind of politics playing out, is foundational to many of the ways in which we think about citizenship. There is a lot of the Ku Klux Klan KKK is based on this idea of racial purity. Why were so many black men lynched? Because the idea that you cannot look at a white woman. Why are so many Muslim and Dalit boys in India killed? Because you cannot look at or marry a girl who is Hindu or upper caste, right? So this idea of racialness and purity and somehow, and it's also very interesting that in Britain, Professor Balmurali Krishna talks about multiculturalism as being a facade for thinking about things. He said, great, I love your diversity, I love your chicken tikka masala, but don't marry my daughter. I will come sit with you in the group and I will have my beer with my chicken tikka masala, but multiculturalism, we'll all sit, we'll share a meal, but don't touch my daughter. So Balmurali Krishna talks about this idea of how multiculturalism again goes back to this idea of the racial one. But the reality is that nobody is racially one. We are all hybrids. We are all the nature of colonialism, the nature of travel, the nature of occupying a force with its sexual violence, which is territorial violence, means that no one, I'm sure we are all mixed. We are all of mixed. And then isolating that racialness as, because now in India, they're trying to bring in a law that says that only people of Hindus who are refugees in other countries can get Indian citizenship. For example, Bengali Muslims in Bangladesh who come into India, still as a result of the post-partition flow, will no longer be given citizenship. That again is racializing. So always citizenship in some ways is always foundationally racial. And again, racial geographies vary. So in the United States, if it's very specifically about anti-blackness, anti-Muslim racism, then in India it's very different. But all of these countries globally have their own.
I just want to ask you one question before I let the audience in to ask you some. It's regarding statelessness. You mentioned briefly about this categorization of putting people in these boxes, regular and illegal immigration and so on. But when it comes to statelessness, it seems like it have become, I don't know if you agree with him, but statelessness have become a way of saying some human beings are lesser than others. Is that, and it's not only about the fact that if you are stateless, you are stateless, but your humanity is being in question.
Well, there are African American citizens in the United States who have citizenship and whose humanity is tested every single day. There are Dalits and Muslims in India, most of them who have equal protection under law, are questioned every single day. You spoke about Shamima Begum, the 16-year-old girl who went and who again left 2 weeks after her mother died of cancer and was groomed and taken away, has been stripped of a citizenship simply based on a single interview. And the anti-racism and the Brexit euphoria not euphoria, this is nonsense anti-racist bullshit that's happening in England, has been stripped of her citizenship. There's been no this idea of natural justice. There's no reasonableness. There's no proportionality, all based on a single interview without context. So yes, statelessness and the refugee crisis are all places where people are not seen human. But there are people with absolute full citizenships with equal protection to law who are not seen as human. Like in the United States, Ilhan Omar, who's a young rep, she's the first black Muslim refugee Somali woman who's been elected to office. And this, apparently, the idea of being elected to public office means that she perhaps has more power than any other black woman in the United States. But just imagine the amount of hate that's directed against her. The idea that when she said that we need to be critical of the funding that we give to Israel, critique of Israel is now seen as anti-Semitism. As a result of this, nobody seems to make the decision, including your New York Times columnists to the president. Her threats against her life have increased. So forget the stateless person who's getting on the boat and who's probably not going to live the journey. We are talking about people with citizenships, with positions of power, at least some kind of electoral power. I mean, I'm assuming a congresswoman in the United States has a little bit more power than a person getting on the boat. So that for me is...
It's interesting that you mentioned Ilhan Omar. Just going to end with that before we let the audience is... a couple of days ago, there was another terror attack or shooting in a synagogue in a temple a Jewish temple in San Diego. And right after that happened, a lot of people condemned. But I also saw that many American conservatives, were trying to put Ilhan Omar, a congresswoman who said something which you can disagree with or agree with, in a same box as a white nationalist who went to a synagogue and killed people. So it's it shows that it's the same people who have no difficulties by denying the existence of Islamophobia, but trying to say that a white nationalist terrorist is the same as a congresswoman who's criticizing foreign policy.
Well, I mean, again, this is where it gets really complicated. I think we need to really break it down into very specific things. First, the men who were responsible for the synagogue murders were also planning on shooting down a mosque. They just got to the synagogue first because it was easier or something. So let's understand that anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, the way that the Nazis, white supremacists, and all these people exercise are intertwined. The very fact that you are beginning to divorce anti-Semitism from Islamophobia is highly problematic. Right? It's not that somehow you're going to love an African-American person and then love someone who's... No. For them, the African American, the Arab, me, anybody, this idea of the racialized other, it's the same. So let's be very clear about that. Second thing is that the United States of America has produced congressmen and senators who have said and vouched for things that the KKK has said. So let's also not give, just because someone is, this is not about Ilhan Omar, just because someone is a congresswoman or a senator or a politician, does not mean that they're above hate speech. The United States president consistently says things that are hate speech. India's Prime Minister Modi consistently says things that are hate speech. Netanyahu consistently says things that are hate speech. I'm sure there are politicians in this country who are elected to public office who regularly say things that are hate speech. So the man who spearheaded stripping of Shamima Begum's citizenship is a brown man who's conservative, who decided that this is how he was going to earn his badges. So let's again be very specific about how we think about this politics, right? Just because you're a everything Ilhan Omar says should also be interrogated. I mean, in many, I think Stephen Salita wrote this page in which a lot of the things that Ilhan Omar actually says is not so radical. So let's also not, her positions on Palestine still, yes, she wants to question Israel's positions, and critique of Israel is conflated as, but let's also not make her look as radical. Her positions on Palestine are pretty centrist. They're not, for example, nobody acknowledges the humanity of the Palestinians, right? So in that sense, I think we need to be very specific about what we say and what we do.
Thanks. Do we have room for some questions? 2-3 questions? Two questions, okay. We can start with Ifit, and if there's someone else, because I'll take the both questions, then let Suchitra. Okay, Ifit.
Okay, so you go for the
Okay. Just stand up and introduce yourself and ask.
Ifit Qureshi, I'm a photographer. Question number one was regarding your work along the border project. If you could say something about that, like what were your experiences of meeting people and
speak a bit louder.
yeah, and
People are out on this side.
all right, okay. I want to ask you about your project Borders
Mhm.
and what kind of stories did you hear along? I know you can't take all of them, but were there any stories that really touched you along the way and which moved you and maybe were an eye opener? I think that was an extremely important project, especially considering what you're talking about now. And the second question is that you've been very open and very critical about, the Indian government. Has that had any repercussions for you?
I'll repeat briefly the questions that Ifit asked. The
Okay.
first question that Ifit asked was regarding Suchitra's project Borderland from 2013. I actually wrote that question down here, but we didn't have time to ask. And the other question was regarding her criticism of the Indian government, if that have made her get some problems.
So the Borderlands project started with my graduate work in the Afghanistan-Pakistan border, and I've been traveling the length of South Asia's border since then. The last of the travel ended last year, and then I'm finishing the book this year. So I'll just reduce it to one, if there's one, because none of these stories are similar. There's nothing. All these stories are. It's you feel like you're purveyors of someone's pain and violence. So again, the idea is to not be that person. Is that people make their own maps. That's the one thing that you hear in all of these communities, is that the maps that people make, the maps that they think of themselves, is very different than the maps that the nation state produces or creates or gives to them. And people are constantly militating in ways that are far more interesting than what we give them credit for. And just letting some of these histories come through. And I think, again, one person cannot do all of this, which means that just giving a space for these things to come and have a space for discussion, I think, is great. And again, a lot of these histories are lost. With the partition history, it's lost. A lot of that is lost. So again, what I would really bring it down to is how people are making their own maps. People have their own ideas of histories of their own communities of belonging, often not reflective of the state maps. I am critical of Modi. Well, the thing is that I'm very insignificant, which means that I don't get trolled as much as the other more vocal people. And your insignificance is a protection against many of this. But yes, I know that I am under surveillance in India. I'm constantly told that you've written this, next time you come, you're not going to be, My phone is under surveillance in India. My friends are under surveillance. Sometimes we get threats, but again, all of them do. So it's not, I don't know, I can't, again, as I said, I'm insignificant, I'm no one. So it's easier for me to hide behind my insignificance. There are women like Rana Ayub, who was trolled, and they morphed her photograph on a porn video and sent it to her father. And her father's really sick. I mean, he didn't fall sick because of this, but he's been sick for a while. Gauri Lankesh was actually shot dead, who was very critical of BJP, was shot dead 2 years ago. She runs the Lankesh Patrika. She was shot dead. Dissent in India people are being picked up. A very dear friend, Khurram Parvez, who was a human rights activist in Kashmir, was arrested 2 years ago. He was held in detention. He was lucky. He was released after 2 months, but anything could have happened to him. People go missing in India. That's what we forget, is that this is not some kind of authoritarian state. This is a liberal democracy in which people have gone missing, and we don't know what's happening. Environmental activist Mugilan, who's been fighting against Vedanta, which is a large Sterlite corporation, disappeared on the 12th of Feb. No, I mean, he's a very well-known, very well-respected man, and nobody knows what happened to him. How is it that someone who's an environmental activist in a democracy just disappears and nobody knows where he is? And he disappeared the day after he screened his documentary, which implicates Vedanta, the mining Sterlite giant that has been responsible for killing people in pro-democracy protests. So when compared to all of that, I don't know, I don't think the threat is higher, but there is a serious crisis that's happening. Again, nobody talks about it. Okay.
Thank you. Was there another person who wanted to? No. Okay. One. Just introduce yourself and.
Yeah, Roger. Yeah, thanks. Roger Evans. I would like to ask. I'm fascinated by this idea you have of a debate or a discussion about something going beyond nationalism. But thanks. The thing I think I'm thinking about was that the nationalism in Europe developed with the Treaty of Westphalia after that ended the 100 Years' War, brutal warfare, and the EU arose out of on the ruins of Europe after World War II. As I see it, there are only two things that look to replace nationalism. One is the EU idea of a supranational state, and the other one is ISIS idea of a Prophet's Ummah, which is a religious construct. So what would you suggest as a third alternative?
I'll have to disagree with these two options. I think communities have imagined themselves differently throughout history. There's a lot of examples of that. I don't think the only solution is something like a supranational state like the EU. Also, EU was built in some ways to not have another Third World War, right? You centralized everything. You centralized your armies, you centralized governance, you centralized certain things, you made movement possible. But the foundational idea of the EU was that there should never be another Third World War in which we come to the brink of destroying humanity. I think that works for EU, or it worked very briefly for EU. But this one overarching idea is never going to work, because you see that problems of EU happen as it's been happening with the Brexit. What I'm thinking is much smaller. What I'm thinking is communities thinking, for example, if all of us in this room decided to create a charter or a manifesto of what is important for us, right? I think that's how community activists have always thought about these things. What would we want, I think, should be the first question. And then we build a political institution and an institution that will safeguard these rights around it later. And I think that is what, when I say let's an invitation to think about freedom as the way forward in terms of nationalism, is that we come together as communities and we decide for ourselves what is important. And once we decide for ourselves what is important, then we decide how do we then get to govern ourselves? How do we get to protect these ideas? What is important for us? And I think that is a conversation. And I think that conversation will vary drastically. It'll vary from a working mother who works 4 jobs to make sure that her kid has a decent access to school. It's going to be very different for a group of people who already have the resources and the materials, who spend, say, $3,000 a month in childcare. Their expectations in life are not going to be the expectations of someone who doesn't have those resources. Now, the problem we have is that both of these people are governed by the same set of laws, often in prioritizing the person with more resources. My question is that, can we imagine a community in which we prioritize what the community wants and then build governance as an aftermath? Of course, all of these ideas are also, again, none of this is a question as it's an incitement to think. Can we think of a different way? Maybe this will not work. Maybe you sit and you discuss, and after 2 years you realize it's not going to work. But the idea is that the incitement to think of different ways of governing ourselves, different ways of aspiring for things that are different ways of thinking about our rights. And no, I don't think there are only 2 models. I think there are many, many ways in which we can think and organize ourselves for better freedoms.
Thank you. I think that was a very good conclusion remark to have. I would like to. There were some. Okay. The debates and discussion can be kept on after this talk, so that would be nice. I'd like to thank Suchitra for her talk and for trying to challenge us all. Especially, I feel challenged by rethinking all of these ideas about freedom, citizenship, and so on. And I want to say gratulerer med dagen. Congrats with today. So have a nice day. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. And thanks for reading whatever I wrote. Thank you.